Today, it seems to me far more important to talk not so much about art in general, or the function of cinema in particular, as about life itself. For the artist who is not conscious of its meaning is unlikely to be capable of making any coherent statement in the language of his own art. In order to define my own tasks, not only as an artist, but above all as a person, I found myself having to look at the general state of our civilization and the personal responsibility of every individual as a participant in the historical process. It seems to me that our age is the final climax of an entire historical cycle in which supreme power has been wielded by the grand inquisitors, leaders, outstanding personalities who were motivated by the idea of transforming society into a more just and rational organization. They sought to possess the consciousness of the masses, instilling them with new ideological and social ideas, bidding them reform the organizational structure of life for the sake of the happiness of the majority. Dostoevsky had warned people of the grand inquisitors who presumed to take upon themselves the responsibility for other people's happiness. We ourselves have seen how the assertion of class or group interests, accompanied by the invocation of the good of humanity and the general welfare, result in flagrant violations of the rights of the individual, who is fatally estranged from society, and how, on the strength of its objective scientific basis in historical necessity, this process comes to be mistaken for the basic subjective reality of people's lives. Throughout the history of civilization, the historical process has essentially consisted of the right way, the correct way, a better way every time, conceived in the minds of ideologues and politicians, being offered to people for the salvation of the world and the improvement of man's position within it. In order to be part of this process of reorganization, the few had each time to wave their own way of thinking and direct their efforts outside themselves to fit in with the proposed plan of action. Thus involved in dynamic outward activity for the sake of a progress that would save the future and mankind, the individual forgot about all that was specifically, personally, and essentially his own. Caught up in the general effort, he came to underestimate the significance of his own spiritual nature, and the result has been an ever more irreconcilable conflict between the individual and society. Concerned for the interests of the many, nobody thought of his own in the sense preached by Christ, love your neighbor as yourself. That is, love yourself so much that you respect in yourself the suprapersonal, divine principle which forbids you to pursue your own acquisitive, selfish interests and tells you to give yourself without reasoning or talking about it, to love others. This requires a true sense of your own dignity, an acceptance of the objective value and significance of the I at the center of your life on earth, as it grows in spiritual stature, advancing towards the perfection in which there can be no egocentricity. In the fight for your own soul, fidelity to yourself demands unceasing, single-minded effort. It is so much easier to slip down than it is to rise one iota above your own narrow, opportunistic motives. A true spiritual birth is extraordinarily hard to achieve. It is all too easy to fall for the fissures of human souls, to abandon your unique vocation, ostensibly in pursuit of loftier and more general goals, and in doing so, to bypass the fact that you are betraying yourself and the life that was given to you for some purpose. The pattern of social relationships has formed in such a way that it is possible for people to ask nothing of themselves, to feel exempt from all moral duty, and only to make demands of others, of humanity at large. They can invite others to be humble and sacrifice themselves, to accept their role in the building of society, while they themselves take no part in the process and accept no personal responsibility for what is happening in the world. 1,000 ways can be found to justify this non-involvement, and the fact that they don't want to give up their narrowly selfish interests in order to work for the nobler goal of their true vocation. Nobody wants or can bring himself to look soberly into himself and accept that he is accountable for his own life and his own soul. On the premise that we are all together, in other words, that mankind is in the process of constructing some kind of civilization, we constantly turn away from personal liability and, without realizing that we're doing so, shift onto others all responsibility for what happens. As a result, the conflict between the individual and society becomes increasingly desperate, and the wall of estrangement between the person and humanity grows even higher. The point is that we live in a society that has been structured by our concerted efforts, and not by the efforts of anyone in particular, in which the personality claims its rights of other people rather than of itself. Consequently, the individual either becomes the instrument of other people's ideas and ambitions, or else he himself becomes a boss who shapes and uses other people's energies with no regard for the rights of the individual. The idea that everyone is responsible for himself seems to have vanished, to have fallen victim to a misconceived common good, in the service of which man acquires the right to be treated with a total lack of responsibility. From the moment when we entrusted to others the solving of our own problems, the rift between the material and the spiritual has been growing. We live in a world governed by ideas in which other people have evolved, and we either have to conform to the standards of those ideas or else alienate ourselves from them and contradict them. A position which becomes more and more hopeless, a bizarre and grim situation. I am convinced that the conflict can only be resolved through a true balance between the spiritual and the material. What is meant by sacrificing yourself to the general good? Surely it betokens a tragic clash between the personal and the general. If a person's sense of responsibility for the future of society is not based on an inner conviction of the part he has to play, if he merely feels entitled to make use of other people, directing their lives for them and indoctrinating them with the idea of their role in the development of society, then the discord between the individual and society can only become more bitter. Freedom of will must mean that we have the capacity to assess social phenomena as well as our relationships with other people, to make a free choice between good and evil. But freedom is inseparable from conscience. And even if it is true that all the ideas developed by the social consciousness are the product of evolution, conscience at least has nothing to do with the historical process. Conscience, both as a sense and as a concept, is a priori immanent in man and shakes the very foundations of the society that has emerged from our ill-conceived civilization. Conscience works against the stabilization of this society. Its manifestations are often at variance with the advantages or even the survival of the species. In terms of biological evolution, conscience has no meaning as a category, but for some reason it nevertheless is there, accompanying man throughout his existence and development as a race. It is obvious to everyone that man's material aggrandizement has not been synchronous with spiritual process. The point has been reached where we seem to have a fatal incapacity for mastering our material achievements in order to use them for our own good. We have created a civilization which threatens to annihilate mankind. In the face of disaster on that global scale, the one issue that has to be raised, it seems to me, is the question of a man's personal responsibility and his willingness for sacrifice, without which he ceases to be a spiritual being in any real sense. I mean that spirit of sacrifice which must constitute the essential and natural way of life of potentially every human being, not something to be regarded as a misfortune or punishment imposed from without. I mean the spirit of sacrifice which is expressed in the voluntary service of others, taken on naturally as the only viable form of existence. And yet in the world today, personal relationships are all too often based on the urge to grab as much as possible from the next person as we jealously protect our own interests. The paradox of such a situation is that the more we humiliate our fellow men, the less satisfied we feel and the greater our isolation becomes. Such is the price of our sin in failing to turn, of our own free choice, to the heroic path of our own human fulfillment, accepting it with our whole heart and will as the one true way and the only thing we desire. Anything less than such total acceptance will exacerbate the conflict between the individual and society. A man will see society as the agency of a violence done to him. For the moment, we are witnessing the decline of the spiritual, while the material long ago developed into an organism with its own bloodstream and became the basis of our lives, paralyzed and riddled with sclerosis. It is clear to everyone that material progress doesn't in itself make people happy, but all the same, we go on fanatically multiplying its achievements. We have reached the point where, as Stalker says, the present has essentially merged with the future, and in the sense that it contains all the preconditions for imminent disaster, we recognize this, and yet we can do nothing to stop it happening. The connection between man's behavior and his destiny has been destroyed, and this tragic breach is the cause of his sense of instability in the modern world. Essentially, of course, what a man does is of cardinal importance, but because he has been conditioned into the belief that nothing depends on him and that his personal experience will not affect the future, he has arrived at the false and deadly assumption that he has no part to play in shaping his own fate. Our world has seen such a disruption of all that should bind the individual to society that it has become supremely important to restore man's participation in his own future. This requires that man should go back to believing in his soul and in its suffering, and link his own actions with his conscience. He has to accept that his conscience will never be at rest as long as what he does is at variance with what he believes, and recognize this through the pain of his soul as it demands he acknowledge his responsibility and his fault. This precludes self-justification through convenient and easy formulae about the fatal influence of other people, never of ourselves, upon what is happening. I am convinced that any attempt to restore harmony in the world can only rest on the renewal of personal responsibility. Marx and Engels say somewhere that history chooses for its own development the worst of the existing variants, and this is true enough if one approaches the question from the point of view of our material existence. They reached that conclusion at a time when history had squeezed out the last few drops of idealism, when man as a spiritual being had ceased to be of significance in the historic process. They observed the situation as it was then, without analyzing its causes, namely, man's failure to recognize that he was responsible for his own spirituality. Once man had turned history into a soulless and alienated machine, it immediately started to require human lives as the nuts and bolts that would keep it going. Consequently, man has come to be regarded first and foremost as a socially useful animal. The only question is how to define social usefulness. By emphasizing the social usefulness of someone's activity to the point where the rights of the personality are ignored, we commit an unforgivable mistake and create all the preconditions for tragedy. The issue of freedom raises the question of experience and upbringing. Modern man, in his struggle for freedom, demands personal liberation in the sense of license for the individual to do anything he wants. But that is an illusion of freedom, and man will only be heading for disenchantment if he pursues it. It takes a long, hard struggle on the part of the individual to liberate his spiritual energies. Upbringing has to be superseded by self-discipline, otherwise he will only be capable of understanding his newly acquired liberty in terms of vulgar consumerism. In this respect, the situation in the West gives us ample food for thought. Incontrovertible democratic freedoms exist side by side with a monstrous and self-evident spiritual crisis affecting free citizens. Why, despite the freedom of the individual, does the conflict between person and society exist here in such an acute form? I think that the experience of the West proves that freedom cannot be taken for granted, like water from a spring that doesn't cost a penny and demands no moral effort from anybody. If that is how he sees it, man can never use the benefits of freedom to change his life for the better. Freedom is not something that can be incorporated into a man's life once and for all. It has to be constantly achieved through moral exertion. In relation to the outside world, man is essentially unfree because he is not alone. But inner freedom he has from the start, if only he can summon the courage and resolution to use it, accepting that his inner experience is of social significance. The man who is truly free cannot be so in a selfish sense, nor can individual freedom be the result of communal effort. Our future depends on no one but ourselves. Yet we have become used to paying for everything with other people's toil and other people's suffering, never our own. We refuse to take into account the simple fact that everything is connected in this world. Nothing can ever be fortuitous, since we are endowed with free will and the right to choose between good and evil. Naturally, the opportunities for asserting your free will are limited by the will of others, but it must nonetheless be said that the failure to be free is always the result of inner cowardice and passivity, of lack of determination in the assertion of your will in accordance with the voice of conscience. In Russia, people are fond of repeating Korolenko's dictum to the effect that man is born for happiness like a bird for flight. It seems to me that nothing could be further from the basis of human existence than these words. I can never see what meaning the concept of happiness as such can actually have for any of us. Does it mean satisfaction, harmony? But a person is never satisfied, for his sights are never ultimately set on specific finite ends, but on infinity itself. Not even the Church can quench man's thirst for the absolute, for unfortunately it only exists as a kind of appendage, copying or even charactering the social institutions by which our everyday life is organized. Certainly in today's world, which leans so heavily towards the material and the technological, the Church so far shows no sign of being able to redress the balance with a call to a spiritual awakening. In this situation, it seems to me that art is called to express the absolute freedom of man's spiritual potential. I think that art was always man's weapon against the material things which threaten to devour his spirit. It is no accident that in the course of nearly 2,000 years of Christianity, art developed for a very long time in the context of religious ideas and goals. Its very existence kept alive in discordant humanity the idea of harmony. Art embodied an ideal. It was an example of perfect balance between moral and material principles, a demonstration of the fact that such a balance is not a myth existing only in the realm of ideology, but something that can be realized within the dimensions of the phenomenal world. Art expressed man's need of harmony and his readiness to do battle with himself within his own personality, for the sake of achieving the equilibrium for which he longed. Given that art expresses the ideal and man's aspiration toward the infinite, it cannot be harnessed to consumerist aims without being violated in its very nature. The ideal is concerned with things that do not exist in our own world as we know it, but it reminds us of what ought to exist on the spiritual plane. The work of art is a form given to this ideal, which in the future must belong to mankind, but for the moment has to be for the few, and in the first instance for the genius who made it possible for human awareness, with all its limitations, to be in contact with the ideal incarnate in his art. In that sense, art is by nature aristocratic. It differentiates between levels of potential, thus ensuring progress from the lower to the higher as the personality moves towards spiritual perfection. Of course, I am not suggesting any kind of class connotation when I use the word aristocratic, rather the contrary, since the soul seeks for moral justification and for the meaning of existence, and moves toward perfection in the course of that search. Everyone is in the same position and all are equally entitled to be numbered among the spiritual elect. The essential division is between those who want to avail themselves of this possibility and those who ignore it. But again and again, art invites people to reevaluate themselves and their lives in the light of the ideal to which it gives form. Korolenko's definition of the meaning of human existence as the right to happiness reminds me of the book of Job, where exactly the opposite view is expressed. Man is born into trouble as the sparks fly upwards. In other words, suffering is germane to our existence. Indeed, how, without it, should we be able to fly upwards? And what is suffering? Where does it come from? From dissatisfaction? From the gulf between the ideal and the point at which you find yourself? A sense of happiness is far less important than being able to confirm your own soul in the fight for that freedom which is, in the true sense, divine, where good and evil are balanced and evil is never allowed to prevail. Art affirms all that is best in man: hope, faith, love, beauty, prayer, what he dreams of and what he hopes for. When someone who doesn't know how to swim is thrown in the water, instinct tells his body what movements will save him. The artist, too, is driven by a kind of instinct, and his work furthers man's search for what is eternal, transcendent, divine, often in spite of the sinfulness of the poet himself. What is art? Is it good or evil? From God or from the devil? From man's strength or from his weakness? Could it be an image of social harmony? Might that be its function? Like a declaration of love, the consciousness of our dependence on each other. A confession, an unconscious act that nonetheless reflects the true meaning of life, love and sacrifice. Why, as we look back, do we see the path of human history punctuated by cataclysms and disasters? What really happened to those civilizations? Why do they run out of breath, lack the will to live, lose their moral strength? Surely one cannot believe that it all happened simply from material shortages. Such a suggestion seems grotesque to me. Moreover, I am convinced that we now find ourselves on the point of destroying another civilization entirely as a result of failing to take account of the spiritual side of the historic process. We don't want to admit to ourselves that many of the misfortunes besetting humanity are the result of our having become unforgivably, culpably, hopelessly materialistic. Seeing ourselves as the protagonists of science, and in order to make our scientific objectivity the more convincing, we have split the one indivisible human process down the middle, thereby revealing a solitary but clearly visible spring, which we declare to be the prime cause of everything, and use it not only to explain the mistakes of the past, but also to draw up our blueprint for the future. Or perhaps the fall of those civilizations means that history is waiting patiently for man to make the right choice, after which history will no longer be driven into an impasse and forced to delete from its scrolls one unsuccessful attempt after another in the hope that the next one may work. There is something in the widely held view that no lessons are learnt from history, and that mankind takes no notice of what history has done. Certainly, each successive catastrophe is evidence that the civilization in question was misconceived, and when man is forced to start all over again, it can only be because up until then, he has had as his aim something other than spiritual perfection. In a sense, Art is an image of the completed process, of the culmination, an imitation of the possession of absolute truth, albeit only in the form of an image, obviating the long, perhaps indeed endless, path of history. There are moments when one longs to rest, to hand it all over, to give it up, along with oneself, to some total world view, like the Veda, for instance. The East was closer to the truth than the West, but Western civilization devoured the East with its materialistic demands on life. Compare Eastern and Western music. The West is forever shouting, "This is me, look at me, listen to me suffering, loving, how unhappy I am, how happy, I, mine, me." In the Eastern tradition, they never utter a word about themselves. The person is totally absorbed into God, nature, time, finding himself in everything, discovering everything in himself. Think of Taoist music, China 600 years before Christ. But in that case, why did such a superb idea not triumph? Why did it collapse? Why did civilization that grew up on such a foundation not come down to us in the form of a historic process brought to its consummation? Did they come into conflict with the materialistic world that surrounded them? Just as the personality comes into conflict with society, that civilization clashed with another. Perhaps it perished, not only for that reason, but also because of its confrontation with the materialistic world of progress and technology. But that civilization was the final point of true knowledge, salt of the earth. And according to the logic of Eastern thought, conflict of any kind is essentially sinful. We all live in the world as we imagine it, as we create it. And so, instead of enjoying its benefits, we are the victims of its defects. Finally, I would enjoin you, confiding in you utterly, to believe that the one thing that mankind has ever created in a spirit of self-surrender is the artistic image. Perhaps the meaning of all human activity lies in artistic consciousness, in the pointless and selfless creative act. Perhaps our capacity to create is evidence that we ourselves were created in the image and likeness of God.